Hello friends, good afternoon and welcome to the EduSite Network. Our topic of discussion today is the concept of citizenship in political theory, and for this very discussion we have thus in our studio subject expert Dr. Satish Kumar Jha, Associate Professor, Department of Political Science, Aryabhatta College, University of Delhi. With this brief introduction, I welcome Sir to our studio. Sir, thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you. In fact, today's discussion we are going to have on the idea of citizenship in political theory, and as we have been discussing in last few lectures spread over a few weeks, what we have discussed are various concepts of political theory, and the concept of citizenship is at the heart of this entire enterprise called political theory, particularly in modern times, because on the one hand it is highly contested arena, because who ultimately becomes a citizen, and what is its sphere of action, what is its definition, how do we understand this entire concept in the modern context. That is one important issue which is at times debated in political theory. But at the same time, one thing is also there, that is the way today we look at this entire idea of citizenship is has evolved over the ages. In fact, from the ancient time we have had powerful articulation of this concept of citizenship. Of course, the context was different, situation was different, and therefore this entire definition was also significantly different. But nonetheless, great political thinkers of ancient time, they engaged with this issue, that ultimately who are the citizens. Particularly, when we study Greek political thought, we have a lot of instances when the Greek thinkers considered this issue as very important issue for for political and the social discourse of that period. So, we will basically also look at this issue, but then from ancient, when we move towards the medieval and modern, there were many modifications, and those modifications were significant, because it tried to look at this entire thing from a different point of view. But when there was the beginning of the modern era, the modernity along with it brought many new features in social and political life of human beings, and one important aspect was, of course, this new definition of citizenship, that how do we look at this concept of citizenship in modern context. Here two things are important: the emergence of modern nation state as well as the emergence of a market or capitalism. These two important dimensions added new meaning to this entire concept, what is normally associated with this liberal discourse on citizenship. Of course, there are two important features here in the modern period. In fact, equality became the central feature of this entire thing, that for having a citizenship right, the first important prerequisite is that there should be equality of opportunity, equality before law, equality in status. So, therefore, this non-hierarchical equal position in the social and political context, that became the defining feature. On the other hand, there was also an attempt to make it a universal thing, and of course, this affiliation with the nation state, the identity defined through the structure of the modern nation state, that was another defining feature. But nonetheless, what happened, that on the one hand it appeared to be more inclusionary, it included a lot of excluded people in the society earlier, because in spite of a very powerful articulation of this concept of citizenship in ancient time, there were a lot of sites of exclusion. There were many features of exclusionary policy, and therefore, what happened in modern time, that on the one hand it became more inclusive, on the other hand it was sought to be made more universal and general, without having any consideration for status of any type. So, therefore, that was of course a sort of achievement, but nonetheless, in fact, it was not free from limitations. There are many limitations of this liberal discourse, and because of those limitations, what happened, that in recent decades it led to a very powerful critique from within, from the liberal tradition itself, and those critiques have tried to basically plug holes in this entire argument. Basically, they have tried to look at this limitation of liberal discourse on citizenship, that how it is individual centered, only individual is considered a bearer of rights. So, citizenship thing is perceived from the vantage point of individual rights and so on and so forth. On the other hand, the other features of individual social life, that is this group identity, the community identity, the communitarian feature of individual life is totally ignored and neglected. So, what has happened that in recent years we have seen a powerful critique coming from two different schools, the communitarians and the multicultural political theories. But apart from this internal critique of liberalism, we have also seen that there are other critiques. For example, the powerful Marxist critique of this liberal discourse of citizenship is there, because Marx from the very beginning tried to look at this entire liberal discourse from the point of view of the birth of capitalism and the new class, that is the bourgeoisie, and therefore he tried to basically problematize this entire issue in a different perspective. So, Marxist critique of course goes beyond this liberal framework and tries to look at it from the point of view of participation, from the point of view of human nature, human species character. For example, he would like to say that what are the species character and how those characters are basically reflected in one's position in politics or in polity or society. So, that way it is much more comprehensive critique of this liberal discourse, but then there are other types of critiques also. For example, the feminists have been very powerful critique of this liberal discourse because of their gender blindness, because they believe that it is in a patriarchal society, this entire discourse is a male dominated discourse, and therefore, the kind of differences which characterize human life, the differences along gender and so on and so forth are ignored, and by ignoring that differentiation, what happens that a very important sphere of woman's life, that is the private life, that is basically the private sphere, is not factored into this entire concept of citizenship. So, on the one hand it promises equality, it talks of justice, but nonetheless it basically creates a situation where the women ultimately remain the sufferer or at the receiving end. So, the feminist critique is also there. We will basically take up all of them one by one, but because of the constraint of time, what I would like to do, that I will basically start with some broad definitional feature of this entire discussion, and then we will move on to the evolution part, that how it has evolved, and then how this liberal modern concept has been very powerful instrument. So, to understand this entire citizenship issue and how it has met with criticisms. But towards the end, if possible, we will also like to have a look at this Indian discourse of citizenship, the way it is available in Indian constitution and so on and so forth. Now, to begin with, in fact, the moment we talk of citizenship, we confront one very important question, that is, who are the citizens? In fact, in any society, in modern society, the citizenship is an important feature of political life, and therefore, the first question which is confronted is, who are the citizens? And the moment we say that who are the citizens, then there is a related question which emerges, that who are excluded from this from this definition of citizens or citizenship, and if someone is excluded, then what is the basis of that exclusion? Now, every constitution in modern times of course discusses this issue, that who are the citizens, what are the rights, and who cannot claim those rights, because who are basically outside this definition of citizenship. Now, therefore, this nature of exclusion is very important, and of course, this nature of exclusion at times is justified and legitimized with reference to a universal set of rules and law. It is not arbitrary, but it is argued that exclusion is basically dependent on certain laws, certain principles, therefore, it is not arbitrary. Now, therefore, what we find that normally we have in basically modern times in political theory two different conflicting versions of citizenship or basically definition of citizenship. Of course, at times attempt is made to combine the two, but nonetheless these two different strands so far as the citizenship is concerned, is quite prominent. The first is attempt to basically look at this entire question of citizenship from the point of view of legal entitlements, from the point of view of legal status, from the point of view of the protection or security under law. Therefore, that if someone is declared a citizen, then that means he or she has certain protection under law, and those protection are the legal protection. So, therefore, it leads to this conceptualization of citizenship as a legal thing, or a kind of it is a legal perspective, one can say. Then there is another equally important perspective, and that is that active participation in political life of the society entitles one to be called a citizen. So, therefore, it is not your rights, the legal rights as enshrined in the constitution or legal document, which make you citizen, but it is on basis of your participation, active participation in political life, that you can claim the citizenship in that particular polity or society. Now, therefore, what happens that these two dimensions which have been contesting with each other, at times the attempt has been made to combine the two. We will basically see that how this has been attempted, and this has been done mostly in modern times. But these two views are basically the gift of the ancient period, because the two important landmarks so far as this historical evolution of citizenship is concerned, we have had this Athenian or the Greek political discourse, which basically put premium on active participation, which basically emphasize the active participation of people in the political life of the society, and therefore, participation became the marker of a citizen. But at the same time, what happened that when we moved further in history, and then there was this dawn of this Roman Empire. Now, what happened, they modified this entire Greek perspective on citizenship, and therefore, it was the beginning of a new understanding, new conceptualization, and it was basically endowed with this legal perspective, and that was that how the law protects one. So, therefore, what happened that on the one hand, this Roman thing graded citizens in the two categories. Therefore, what happened that because of this imperial discourse of the Rome, ancient Rome, what happened that new types of people were incorporated and integrated. So, it became more inclusionary, that it included people, but of course, while including the new set of people, it did not provide them the same status. So, there was a hierarchy in status. So, few people became citizen due to just legal entitlement, particularly the protection, that because the law protected them, and other because they were the active members in the political life. So, therefore, this differentiation was there, but nonetheless, the beginning of this legal perspective on citizenship can be traced with this Roman thing. So, therefore, this thing has persisted, the two understanding of citizenship, one that as a legal status, and second as active participant in the political life. Now, along with these two issues, which are basically hotly contested, and therefore, this rationale is provided for both argument. You have the another important issue, which is basically today stirring many minds, and that is there is a relationship between individual and community. Now, the rights and responsibility, the two important issues. That what is the relationship between individual and the community? When you talk of citizen, we are basically talking of an individual citizen, or we are talking of a individual located and situated in a group and community. And secondly, the rights and responsibility, the duties as well as the entitlements. So, these issues are there, but when we come to this contemporary debate, particularly the recent debates, recent years, as I was referring to earlier, that is how this liberal debate, liberal discourse on citizenship has been subjected to very rigorous criticism, and those criticisms are basically the hallmark of the contemporary debate on citizenship. Now, what has happened that this contemporary debate is largely on certain issues, and one of the important issues is around equality and rights. Second is on individual and group relationship, and individual and community relationship. Then this active and passive citizens, because when you talk of active citizens, as we were referring to earlier, that it started in the Greek period, that active participation in political life is the marker of a citizen. whereas the passive citizens the concept of passive citizen doesn't factor in this participation, rather they would simply look at that how law protects an individual, and therefore, if this umbrella of law is there to protect him or her, then one can say that he or she is a citizen or enjoying the citizenship status. So, basically here it becomes passive, the object of law, not the subject of politics, rather object of politics and object of law and state. So, therefore, this active and passive thing. Now, then what happened, that this relation of rights and duties, or the primacy of rights and duties, whether citizens the rights are more important than duties, or both are related to each other. So, for example, even in Indian constitution you have a whole chapter on fundamental rights, but then there is also certain duties of the citizens. So, now even the Supreme Court now says that the rights of course are justiciable, but while doing that one should also not be totally oblivious of the fact that every citizen has certain duties. So, I mean gradually this rights and duties combination is also emerging, but all these issues therefore are basically part of this contemporary debate on citizenship and so on and so forth. When basically we will take up these issues just after looking at this meaning of citizens, that what is the meaning of citizens. When we say the citizen, then basically more often than not today, in today's context, we primarily refer to the legal formal status, as I just mentioned earlier, that who is legally a citizen, whom constitution recognizes as a citizen. Now, what happens that when you talk of this legal connotation of this citizen, then basically what is implied is a specific nationality, then holding of the passport, that whether one is holding the passport or not, whether the rights guaranteed in the constitution are meant for him or not, and then the duties. So, therefore, legally these things are basically explained and understood, that citizenship is defined with reference to law as existing or prevailing on the land. So, therefore, what happens according to the existing law of the land, who is a citizen would be defined with reference to these important factors, that is nationality, holding of passport, the rights guaranteed in constitution, and so on and so forth. But in fact, what we should remember that when we talk of citizenship, then this citizenship idea goes beyond this legal framework, legal formal framework, and it denotes not only the legal formal thing, but it is also substantive in nature. Now, because the moment we say substantive, then what is implied, that there is more substance in this than normally we understand it. Now, what has happened, that a very eminent scholar on citizenship, that is T.H. Marshall, in his book Citizenship and Social Class in 1950, this book was published, and he gives a very clear and comprehensive definition of citizenship. For example, Marshall says that full and equal membership in political community is basically the hallmark of citizenship, equal and full membership. So, therefore, what Marshall does, that he makes equality and integration the defining features of this concept of citizenship. Now, what has happened, that this equality therefore in modern times has been considered a very important feature of citizenship, and as you will see later, that this entire thing emerged from the French Revolution. The French Revolution, in fact, one can consider it to a gift of the French Revolution, that basically dismantling of all hierarchies, all status, and equality, liberty and fraternity, as it was basically, they were the slogan of the French Revolution. So, equality entered this discourse of citizenship. Now, therefore, what has happened, that today's in context, normally the citizenship is understood, the citizenship is considered to be based on equality of status and equality of opportunities and equality before law. So far as this word citizen is concerned, we find that it comes from the Latin word civis. Now, the civis has a Greek equivalent in polis. So, therefore, anyone who is a member of polis or the city can be called a citizen. So, therefore, its origin goes back to the ancient period. Now, of course, as we have seen that this has been used from time to time, from ancient to the modern times. Now, if we go to the evolution of this concept of citizenship, then we find that this has been continuously evolving, and it has evolved over the ages, and not only evolved, but this has also been changing. Now, what has happened that this evolution and the changing dimension of the citizenship can be seen from the point of view of 2-3 important facts. Number one, that for becoming citizen, what is required? Now, whether it is the extension of status that can basically lead to the citizens, that if you are from the high class, you are from the high caste, you are from the more noble origin, then automatically you can claim citizenship, or it is basically dismantling of structure of operation, as we were mentioning that the French Revolution stood for this. Now, what happened that there are different responses to these two twin questions, that is extension of status, or another is more liberatory, that is dismantling of these hierarchies or structure of operation. The responses to these questions have been whether the rights and duties are the defining feature, or the arena of politics or activity can be the hallmark of one's claim to citizenship. And this is what basically we can say that the two important contestation today, the active participation, what is called civic republicanism, republican tradition, another is the basically the legal entitlements and so on and so forth. Now, what has happened that there is no consensus, because before we go ahead we should also basically understand one thing, that there is no consensus on these two issues, that whether it is only a status or measure of activity, whether only legal status or the measure of activity, that should be considered important for this concept of citizenship, or what is significant, that is autonomy of individual or the community. Now, the multicultural and the communitarian perspectives are basically largely on this issue of individual and the community rights, that what is more important, autonomy of individual and autonomy of the group. Then the next issue, which is also not leading to any consensus, is that what is the legitimate unit of citizenship, whether it is a nation state or is a global civil society, the global community. And in today's context, it is becoming very important, because we should understand the way this globalization, in era of globalization, new structures, new processes have been unleashed, and therefore, today we talk of a global civil society. Today we hear of a global community. There is of course a global political organization, that is United Nations. Then you have many regional political organizations, for example, European Union, South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, and so on and so forth. So, therefore, what has happened that you find that there are number of issues which are at times debated. Now, coming to this question of this evolution, what we find that this evolution can be divided into 4 different parts, and the first important period in history which can be associated with this concept of evolution of the citizenship concept is the classical Greco-Roman period, the ancient Greece and ancient Rome. Now, what happened that this ancient Greek and ancient Roman period interestingly had a very important component of this civic republican tradition. Of course, not in the Roman, but in the Greek thing. The Roman was of course different, because it was not on basis of the active participation of people, but rather in terms of the legal status, the legal protection that the Romans basically tried to look at this question of citizenship. Now, the second important period in this evolution is this later medieval or basically early modern period. Now, that is the time when you have had this powerful discourse associated with the liberal concept of citizenship. But in the first phase of this discourse, the liberal discourse, there was basically lot of continuity between the Roman and the early modern, because this legal discourse of the Romans continued in early modern. So, therefore, you had Bodin and many other jurists looking at citizenship from the point of view of legal entitlements or legal status or legal protection. Then you had the 19th century. Now, 19th century, what happened, that you had the birth of liberalism and capitalism in full form, and therefore, you have altogether a different discourse on citizenship from the point of view of individual entitlements, from the point of view of market, from the point of view of private interests, from the point of view of law and so on and so forth. Interestingly, here there was an attempt also to combine the two things, the Greek tradition and the Roman tradition, but nonetheless the primacy was accorded to the Roman tradition of law and legal protection. Then you had the 20th century. Now, 20th century, what happened, that you had a powerful contestation on this notion of citizenship as it was understood within the liberal tradition, and this contestation or this challenge came from 2-3 important schools. One was of course multiculturalism, the second was the community rights, communitarians, and then of course the feminists, then of course some other school of thought. So, basically what happened, that it was a continuously under attack in 20th century, this concept. Now, what happened, that along with these four periods which we have just now mentioned, we also have had two strands of political thinking so far the citizenship is concerned. The first, in these four periods, these two strands overlapped. For example, the first strand was this tradition of civic republicanism. Now, the civic republicanism, to put it briefly, stands for idea of common good, it stands for public spirit, it stands for political participation, and therefore, it stands for civic virtue. So, therefore, this is what normally we imply by active notion of citizenship, that participation becomes the defining feature of citizen, that how you participate, how you partake, how you basically involve yourself in the political affairs of the society. So, that becomes the hallmark of a citizen, and it is here that the Greek and particularly the Athenians system or Athenian discourse had lot to contribute. Now, what has happened, that this has of course recently been tried to be resurrected, this civic republicanism, after dissatisfaction with the liberal discourse of citizenship, which is more geared towards law, rights, then protection and so on and so forth, the private interests, no regard or no basically attention to the public interest, the public spirited nature of man or woman is totally sidestepped, and therefore, the private interest becomes a defining feature with with reference to rights, law and so on and so forth. So, therefore, this dissatisfaction in recent years has led to a new quest to revive this civic republican tradition of the Greek period. So, thus now this civic republicanism, we will just see that how the contemporary scholars, in the hands of contemporary scholars, this civic republicanism has again been resurrected. Now, the another strand, that is the liberal citizenship, individual rights and private interests. So, these two strands, in fact, you find that even in contemporary times when the citizenship question is being hotly debated, these two things are basically contesting for supremacy. At times attempt is made to combine the two, but nonetheless they are divided along these two lines. But of course, in all these discourses, we find that there is a primacy of participation and there is a primacy on law. But then there are other social economic factors that even in modern times when equality has been privileged, but equality only formal equality, not the substantive equality. But lot of criticisms have emerged from certain schools of thought who basically try to look at this question of citizenship going beyond these existing frameworks. And two important notable critiques which can be mentioned here are the Marxists and the Feminists. So, basically the Marxist and feminist critique of course is a very important critique of these existing discourses, those existing discourses which try to combine the classical Roman, the classical the Greek traditions, as well as which is basically based on the achievement of the modern, particularly the French Revolution, the equality and the subsequent periods in history when other features of the liberal society, the liberal discourse were incorporated. Now, to begin with the classical period, so far as this concept of civic republicanism is concerned, as I mentioned that it is basically essentially based on the principle of sharing power. Now, basically the sharing power is essentially meant to prevent the rise of arbitrary use of power or authoritarianism. So, basically it is sharing of power is an antidote to autocratic rule. Now, what has happened that citizens' involvement in the political life is considered a value in itself, and therefore, it is worth pursuing. So, that is the ideal, that how citizens participate in the political life of the society. Now, the Greek period, two important units or two important systems were available in Athens and the Sparta. Interestingly, the Athenian system privileged democracy, whereas the Spartan system was based on the authoritarian regime or authoritarian principle. But nonetheless, both considered civic republicanism to be a virtue to be pursued by a citizen. Now, this public service or the public spirited nature of individual was highlighted and basically was given primacy both in Athens and Sparta, in spite of the differences in their political system, as one was basically based on the principle of democracy, another was based on the principle of autocratic rule. Now, the Greek thinker Aristotle and his basically one of the famous writing, the Politics, what in fact we find that he considers politics to be the essential nature of man, the participation. Therefore, man is a political animal. So, therefore, one gets realization, human beings get their realization, self-realization only by virtue of the fact that they participate in the political life. So, this was the status they accorded to this question of participation. Now, what happened that only it is in the polis, it is only in the polis that individuals become individuals. So, basically the realization is possible only through participation. So, active participation basically became the hallmark of this definition of citizenship. Now, trust and then familiarity with the fellow beings, all these things were accompanying this concept. Now, what has happened that condition of freedom therefore was made contingent on this participation in the political life in the polis. So, this entire concept of civic republicanism, that individual rights are basically based on the civic virtues, and those virtues are largely the participatory nature of human beings in the political life became the hallmark of this civic republican discourse in the ancient Greek period. Of course, one thing is important to remember, that in spite of the focus on participation, in spite of focus on virtues, civic virtues, public spirited nature of man, in spite of all these important admissions and important formulations, the Greek notion of citizenship was based on exclusion or exclusionary principles, because the citizenship idea did not include a large number of people in society. For example, women, slave, alien people, or basically the children, they were not part of this framework of citizenship, because there were a lot of limitations imposed on them. So, therefore, what happened that it was a limited concept, and citizenship was basically the privilege of few. So, therefore, in spite of a very important formulation, what we find that it was highly limited in the scope, and therefore, it was exclusionary in nature. Now, when we moved from this ancient to this Greek period to the Roman period, there are many changes or modification. Now, largely on account of the nature of the rule at that time, that was the Roman imperialism. Now, what happened that this Roman imperialism led to incorporation of large number of people into into society, either by conquest or by war, and so on and so forth. So, what happened that everyone had to be included in this new framework. So, therefore, it became more inclusionary compared to the Greek period, but the inclusion of course was not of one type. So, it was a graded inclusion. Now, this gradation took place on basis of two consideration, and that gradation also led to a new concept of citizenship, that is the passive citizens, that unlike this Greek period, now you have the concept of a passive notion of citizenship. Now, what happened that because the heterogeneous amount of people and cultures were incorporated, therefore, this gradation was basically necessary. So, therefore, because of this gradation, what happened, on the one hand the inclusion took place, but it was an imperial inclusion, not a democratic inclusion. So, therefore, this gradation and status remained there. Now, what happened that for some people the citizenship was made available through the framework of law. So, legal status, the passive citizens, that even without participating in the political life, one can claim the status of citizens. How one can claim? You can claim only on basis of the protection which is available to you under law. So, basically you become a passive recipient of this status. On the other hand, the concept of active citizenship was meant for those who were the active participant in decision making and political process. So, two concepts, the passive and active, emerge here, but along with this passive and active, you also find that emergence of this legal framework of citizenship, that protection under law, that citizen means those who have protection of law. So, therefore, what has happened that became basically this passive citizen became not the participant citizen, but it became the bearer of rights citizen, that it had certain rights under the law, and therefore, he was a citizen, not because of the fact that he or she was participating. Now, what happened that in Greek period you had one type of citizens, now in the Roman period you had two types of citizens, one protection by law and another the active participant. But one thing is interesting here, that the kind of exclusion we saw in the Greek period, those exclusions were not totally removed even in the Roman period. Exclusion on basis of class status and exclusion on basis of gender differentiation, that continued. Now, the third period of evolution from the Greek to Roman, then you have had this modern period. Now, in modern period what happened that this legal discourse of citizenship which we find that emerged during the Roman period continued, and as I was mentioning that Boda basically became the important proponent of this notion of the passive citizens, basically protection under law. Now, security and protection of law became the hallmark of this concept of citizenship. Now, not only Boda, but the early liberal thinkers, all of them basically looked at this question of citizenship from this point of view. So, therefore, what happened that you have Thomas Hobbes, basically Montesquieu, Locke, all of them talked of citizenship from the point of view of law and protection. For example, for Hobbes, protection meant protection of physical life. For Montesquieu, protection means protection of family and home. Now, for Locke, protection means protection of property and conscience. So, therefore, basically what happens that ultimately one becomes the protectee or basically the recipient of protection. So, therefore, no political position that not because of your participation or your active involvement in political life, that your citizenship identity is being given, but because of the fact that you enjoy certain protections of law, therefore, you are basically accorded the status of citizen. So, from active to the passive concept of citizenship becoming prominent in the early modern or early liberal phase, and therefore, one can see coming from these eminent liberal thinkers of this period, Hobbes, Montesquieu, Locke, Baudin, and so on and so forth. Now, what has happened that this the protection or the passive notion of citizenship was of course dominant within the liberal discourse in this period, but then we should also remember one thing, that there was a continuous nostalgia for the earlier active notion of citizenship, or a nostalgia for that civic republican tradition which the Greeks had championed. So, this nostalgia for the civic virtue can be seen in thinkers like Machiavelli, you can see in a thinker like Rousseau, and therefore, what happened that the American and the French Revolution, now what happened that talked about this civic virtue of this participatory nature of human beings. Of course, it was not realized in fullness, but nonetheless that nostalgia was quite visible in two important revolutions of modern times, and they are also quite visible in the writings of thinkers like Machiavelli and Rousseau. Now, what has happened that it became an ideal civic virtue. Now, for example, Machiavelli's classical republicanism became the ideal, in spite of the fact that as an important liberal thinker, Machiavelli is credited for bringing many important aspects of liberal discourse under the discussion, but nonetheless, so far as this ideal civic virtue is concerned, that nostalgia can be seen, that how participation completes human personality, how political participation or active involvement in politics is important dimension of human life. Now, similarly in Rousseau, you can find that a civic virtue and participation become important elements of citizenship identity. So, therefore, what happened that in modern period, you can see the both concepts are basically vying with each other for supremacy and dominance, but nonetheless, the first tradition, as I was mentioning, the legal tradition, the protection under law, the passive notion of citizenship was more dominant. Now, what has happened that this French Revolution, of course, I was referring to French and American War of Independence, the two important liberal hallmarks so far as the revolutionary upsurge in the society is concerned. They contributed significantly in many important spheres so far as the evolution of liberalism is concerned, but one important dimension of this French Revolution was this concept of dismantling of hierarchy or the horizontal rights, equal horizontal rights of the people. So, equality became important basically dimension of the political discourse after the French Revolution, but along with this equality, there was also a kind of civic republican dimension of the French Revolution that should also be acknowledged, because it was very much there, particularly in the discourse of thinkers like Rousseau and so on and so forth. Now, from this 18th century, when we move to 19th and 20th century, we find that altogether new social context is emerging. That context is the rise of capitalism, the fuller development of the liberal thought and liberal discourse, and therefore, now a different set of considerations enter into this understanding of citizenship. And it is here that we should basically remember one of the important scholar, the thinker on citizenship in modern times, and he is T.H. Marshall, particularly his book Citizenship and Social Class. Now, what has happened that Marshall, when talking of citizenship in modern times, he feels that citizenship has evolved along with the changes in the class structure or class composition of society, or along with the evolution of modern capitalist economy and society. Now, Marshall traces this evolution with reference to three different phases of the evolution of rights. Now, what has happened that in his opinion the first stage was the stage of the evolution of civil rights. Now, civil rights, the right to expression, right to press and so on and so forth, freedom to assemble, all these civil rights of course were the hallmark of 18th century, and in nature they were of course negative, because they did not give any positive content to the rights, but negative, it basically provided some protection to the people. Then 19th century you have had the evolution of rights along this political line. So, you had the political rights, right to franchise, right to representation, political participation and so on and so forth. And finally, in 20th century you have had the evolution of social rights, for example, which ultimately in Marx's opinion led to the rise of the welfare state. So, basically the social class and citizens, and this evolution of this equality dimension, which he had put very clearly in his definition of citizenship, also came along with this evolution of rights and evolution of citizenship. So, along with this evolution of society, evolution of classes, evolution of economy, what has happened, that this concept of citizenship has also evolved, and therefore, it ultimately came to a situation where this equality became the hallmark of this concept of citizenship. Now, of course, this modern liberal concept of citizenship, therefore, in the opinion of Marshall, can be identified with two core principles. One is equality, another is universality. That universally the laws are universal in nature, and therefore, citizenship identity is also universal in nature, particularly within the bound of the national territory. And secondly, the equality is the defining feature, and it is here this universality and equality dimension of the liberal discourse of citizenship which have become highly contentious in today's context. And it is on these two issues, the universal nature of this discourse, and it is on this basis of equality which is criticized on basis of its basically its tilt towards the formal equality, that the contemporary critiques of this liberal notion have basically tried to totally oppose this perspective, and it is here that communitarians and the multiculturalists are quite important. But within liberal tradition there is one important development, and that took place in 70s, and that was John Rawls, his publication of his book Theory of Justice in 1971. That was a very powerful intervention on this question. Now, what Rawls did, that he basically tried to create a situation, imagined a situation through his hypothetical state of nature, where he wanted to create a system of justice which was based on fairness, and that fairness was basically based on the principle of liberty, equality, and then also a kind of discrimination which was a positive discrimination in interest of the least privileged. So, Rawls, of course, recognizing this limitation of this liberal discourse, tried to rectify it, but nonetheless those things remain. But Rawls became a very powerful source of inspiration for subsequent developments in political theory so far as citizenship is concerned, particularly the communitarians and the multiculturalists. Now, what has happened, that outside this liberal framework, as I was referring, you have had a very powerful critique coming from the Marxist tradition, and Karl Marx, particularly in his writing on Jewish question, took up this issue up front. Now, for Marx, this entire liberal concept of citizenship is basically a facade. It talks of rights, it talks of equality, it talks of liberty, but in essence it is only the rights and liberty of a dominant class in the society, that is the capitalist class. So, therefore, the Marxist criticism is along the line of the class differentiation in society, and therefore says that citizenship, legal citizenship, the passive citizenship which is given by the liberal polity, the liberal discourse, is basically a kind of sham, because it is meant only for the handful or some dominant interests, but others are basically only duped because they are called citizens, but they do not have any meaningful rights, because those rights are illusory rights. Now, the feminists, as I was telling you, another important critique of this liberal discourse is coming from the feminists. Particularly, they believe that this liberal discourse has been talking about equality, but it is informed by gender blindness, and therefore, they do not take into account a large number of members of the society, and they are women, the female members, because it is a male dominated society. So, when it talks of rights, it talks of equality, it is only the male image which is basically there in that discourse, but not the female image. And therefore, what has happened, that this concept of citizenship ignores a very important sphere from the people's life, that is the private sphere, that is the sphere of women's action. And therefore, they believe that private is basically personal is political, and therefore, try to bring this personal into the public sphere. Rather, they try to basically feminize this public sphere, which is a male dominated sphere. So, therefore, this concept of citizenship under the hands of the feminist scholars has acquired a new meaning, where this universality has been criticized on basis of totally erasing the differences in society, that universal rights, universal equality, universal justice cannot take care of the interest of those who are different in their identities. So, identity issue therefore, in the citizenship discourse has become very prominent in recent times, and it has become more prominent in the hands of thinkers who are associated with multicultural and the communitarian schools. So, this differentiated concept of citizenship, that how the individual discourse which talks of unencumbered self is totally fallacious, because self is a situated self, and therefore, individual is individual only in context of its location in the group, and therefore, the group identity cannot be erased altogether. So, therefore, this entire discourse of citizenship in recent years has acquired new meaning. The meaning has been basically given in context of individual identity, in the context of the group, the culture and community. Now, it is in this context that this multicultural theory with the focus on the minority rights has also chipped in, and they have also brought this question of cultural differences in society and individuals' identity, how can be associated with this cultural context of individual in the society. So, the multiculturalism and communitarianism, two important schools of thought in social science, literature and so on and so forth, have been trying to basically wrestle with this issue of the citizenship, and they have been trying to basically enrich this liberal discourse, which was on the one hand gender blind, on the other hand it had no consideration for different identities in society. So, this citizenship discourse has been enriched by these interventions. But with the emergence of this globalized world, what has happened, that the context of citizenship debate has also acquired a different meaning, that who is ultimately the main unit to affiliate or give affiliation to citizenship or to identify citizenship, whether it is a nation state or the global civil society. Now, in a globalized world, when the entire world is shrinking, this issue is becoming very important, that whether the global civil society can be considered more important or the nation state. So, these issues are emerging in a big way today in today's context in political theory, so far as this idea of citizenship is concerned, but this debate goes on.
Right. Thank you so much, sir, and thank you again, friends, for watching. Have a wonderful day ahead.